In 1986, an estate agent, Suzy Lamplugh, left her place of work in order to do a property viewing, but she never returned. The police will focus on a single diary entry, and in their search of a crime fitting the disappearance, they found a criminal to fit the crime. There will never be enough evidence to convict this man, but in the eyes of many people, Mr. Kipper diary entry was the only one that mattered. Today, we'll re-examine this theory and the diary entries the police ignored in an attempt to shed a light on what could have really happened to Suzy Lamplugh 36 years ago. What is going on here? What is going on? What is going on? Okay, detective unit, my laptop is going for a software update on its own accord. It just did not get the memo that I'm recording, so be right back, I guess. Can't believe I caught this on camera. For what reason? For what reason? Out of everything dumb that happens in my life, this is the part that I'm catching on camera. Look at it. There we go. There we go. Just doing its thing. Just doing its thing. Be right back. Join me on a plant watering journey while we wait for the software to upload. Go. Don't overwater it. Okay, I think that's enough. Little orchid here. What is this? What does it serve for? Does anybody know? This little stick. Well, that has been entertaining. I'm just gonna kick this off. There's still 10 minutes to that software update, so thank you for bearing with me, for a screensaver to pop back on the screen behind me, and also for bearing with me while I go through my day-to-day full-time job and then research in my free time in order to release this video this week. I know there was a long wait, which usually I post like, part 2 just a couple of days after part 1, but hey, thank you. I appreciate you, and if I sound more nasal than usual, it is because just like with every deep dive, they affect me. They take a bit of my soul, they take a good chunk of it actually, and I just always fall ill. It just always freaking happens. I cannot avoid it. We just deal with it and we move on. Because this might be the longest video in the history of this channel, as I always say, and it might have to be split in two, let me not bother you with a longer intro and let us actually dive in. So the way I plan to structure this last bit, whether I split it in two or not, of Suzy Lamplugh's case is to give you a brief recap, but as always before part 2 comes part 1, so if you haven't already watched part 1, watch that before coming over here, because I will literally just recap it in about 60 seconds. Then we are going to be talking about the murder of Shirley Banks, how that happened, how the police here in London found out about that murder, how Suzy's disappearance and Shirley's murder were connected. Then we are going to go into the background of the supposed Mr. Kipper, the prime suspect in this case. We're going to talk about his upbringing, his crimes, why the public still doesn't drop that theory, and then we'll break down the theory, sort of following through the weekend before Suzy's disappearance and where this man was. Could he have been the possible suspect? That is mostly again based off of the book, and a lot of things from his background are based off of the online research. Then we will follow through the investigation from the point where we left it off last week to where it stands now, what's going on at this moment, where that person that is still considered a prime suspect by so many people is right now, and then we will discuss the second possible theory that David introduces in his book. Which, have you bought the book? Do you listen to me? Have you put some respect to Caroline's name by now? Go buy it, read it right now. Put some dollar in this man's bank account. So in part 1, we met Suzy Lamplugh. We learn about her background, about her strict upbringing, Wesleyan Methodism, family, about her childhood, how she was raised to have monogamous views when it came to relationships, and how in her life that might not have been the truth. She did have a boyfriend at the time of her disappearance. However, from what public was saying was discovered through her personal diaries later, she might have had a couple of relationships before, she might have had something going on at the time, but nothing will ever to this day be confirmed. We spoke about Suzy switching jobs from a beautician job to the estate agent job. If you hear that, that's the wind. It's dead windy here in London. It's the creepiest fucking sound. I kind of hope this road mic takes it out, I just know it won't. Well, at least I don't have to play creepy music in the background because this just adds to it. We spoke about the dynamics of her job, about her weekend prior to her disappearance, about Suzy losing the items that weekend, the checkbook and the personal diary that will later be found in a pub. And then on the Monday of her disappearance, Suzy would come to work as usual. She would do a couple of hours of her shift and then would put a diary entry for a property viewing at 12:45 p.m. She would, apart from that diary entry, put two others that were significantly ignored by the public. And then, after that supposed property viewing, nobody actually reported her missing straight away. They waited for her to go to another viewing that was also noted down in that diary for 6 p.m. And once she didn't show up for that viewing, the alarm bells went off and they finally alerted the police. This would mean that at least one of those 3 diary entries would be legitimate, and that's why she was only reported missing 6 hours since she left her workplace. Her car would be found that evening at around 10 p.m. There will be no car keys inside, and the driver's seat was completely pushed back, which didn't fit Suzy's height. There was also 15 pounds in her car, meaning that even if she went with the intention to have a lunch at some point, whatever happened to her before she had the time to spend that money. And it was also interesting what was missing from the car: the checkbook and the personal diary that were still at the pub. It would only be once people at the pub found out about Suzy's disappearance that those items would be handed over to the police. We left part 1 off with a sketch of a man that was circulating the media with no avail, and another murder, the one of Shirley Banks. So let us pick up in that timeline and speak about the murder of Shirley Banks that happened by most accounts between October the 8th and the 9th of 1987. So on October the 8th, 1987, Shirley actually missed out on meeting her husband after just going to buy a blouse. I think there was a receipt about her buying something in Debenhams in Broadmead in Bristol. Shirley would have this trip later in a day because the receipt would show that she bought this top at 7:40 p.m. And then she was supposed to just return home. At 8:30, when she didn't, her husband started looking. He alerted the friends and family and they started looking for favorite pubs and bars, starting phoning everybody, trying to see if she will appear. And then he decided, okay, I'm not gonna report this to the police, I'll wait for next morning, because she was supposed to show up for work. Then the next day, when she phones the workplace, the manager of Shirley's tells him that she has actually phoned in sick 15 minutes ago. So again, no alarm bells are going in this man's head because this manager, of course, didn't spot anything, any sort of horror in this woman's voice. It just sounded like normal Shirley. She just called in sick. So again, he waits the whole day for Shirley, maybe she's angry at him, fuck knows what happened, to return home. And when she doesn't, that's when he alerts the police. Just like in Suzy's case, the searches would immediately begin, all of the police officers would be on it, and they would find out that Shirley's car was also missing. And that will turn up to be a vital clue in her investigation later. But for 3 weeks, they're searching to no avail. They can't find the body, they can't find where Shirley is, they can't find her alive. They really hit the dead end. That would be until 3 weeks after Shirley's disappearance. On October the 29th, 1987, a man entered a dress shop in Leamington Spa around 4 p.m. Now, I can't guarantee you many things in this life, but I can guarantee that every single woman watching this video has had this experience of a man coming into their personal space, whether it is on the tube, whether it is in a shop, wherever the hell it is, and immediately wanting to get the hell out of there. And the man that entered this shop will be exactly one such man. He entered with a knife hidden inside of his jacket pocket, but because he's a freaking creep, that was very obvious, and because the knife had orange handle on it, so it was very obvious that he's concealing something that he shouldn't be. He's inside of a dress shop where he technically doesn't have any reason to be, and he is just looking all disturbed. And there are two women in this shop, a manager and the shop owner, and he immediately advises the shop owner to go close the door and then the manager to switch the lights off. And the owner sees the opportunity there, taking the keys, slowly going to the door, making him feel super uneasy. And as soon as she gets to that door, she screams outside and she sort of tries to leg it. She says there's a man with a knife inside of the store. So people hear it from the street and this man tries to leg it. Now, because he didn't come prepared, we don't know if this is his first time, we don't know if this is just how this man operates.
Then, 3 weeks later, at Leamington Spa, 80 miles from Bristol, a man was caught trying to rob and rape two women in a clothes shop.
He managed to escape, but during his escape he left things that he was wearing and also the knife inside of a plastic bag. So at first people find the plastic bag and then nearby they find this man who is suddenly underdressed and suspiciously covering one of his hands inside of the pocket. And obviously they ask him to take the hand out and he managed to cut his hand, so clearly they know this is the person, and then the shop owner also picked him from the lineup later. And this man will be taken into custody, and this is when we finally learn his name, John David Guys Cannan. Now that they have him in custody, the police goes through his car, and at that time in 1987, John Cannan indeed did have a BMW. So they go through his car, they find in a glove box a hidden car tax disc that belonged to Shirley Banks. Then they obtain a search warrant to go search his house, and here in his garage they're going to find another car that did not belong to him. Rather, they find a car that Cannan actually repainted blue. And because of that tax disc, they can confirm that this is indeed Shirley's car, that it has just been meddled with, because apart from repainting it, he had also changed the license plates on the car. And the license plates will begin with the letters SLP, which police would later say stood for Suzy Lamplugh.
I remember saying to John, why had he chosen the letters SLP, and did he understand the significance of those letters? And he said yes, he did. And I asked him to explain. And he said, I understand they could be interpreted as Suzy Lamplugh, the letters SLP. And again, I said to him, explain the significance of those letters. He said, I bought that car off of a Bristol businessman for £100. He said, that man is in a lot of trouble. I said to him, John, you are in a lot of trouble. You're in prison. He said, yes, but he said, that man committed the murders of Shirley Banks, Suzy Lamplugh, and another girl. And I said to him, is that man you, John? And he said, yes. He then said, no, 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 and retracted it very quickly. And stood up, and we had a break because he was very emotional. And I went outside and said to my colleague, he said yes, he said yes.
According to the documentary that I watched on this case, where you see me play some clips from, he would apparently say to the detectives at the time that he understands the significance of those letters, that he understands the significance of a different person's car found at his property, and then he would just sort of go into the denial and say no, no, no. According to David's book and also the online sources, Cannan would never admit to having anything to do with Shirley's murder. But then he would also say he never had anything to do with entering that shop, and obviously that was connected to him because his sorry ass was literally chosen from a lineup. So we know that this isn't really the man that can be trusted on everything. And then the police, keeping him in custody for at least 70 days until bringing some charges based off of what they will find at his flat, they start looking into his criminal history. So during the time that the police had searched his flat, they will find a cleaning ticket for a shop that was located near his family's house in Sutton Coldfield. And this is where he would have taken a raincoat with red marks on it. According to this source that I found online, he went into this shop telling them that the red marks are because he made love in a park in red mud. No comment. And then the forensic experts apparently got a hang of this raincoat before this cleaning laundrette place, whatever it is, actually managed to clean this raincoat, and they actually found that no, these were bloodstains, and they were of the same blood group that Shirley Banks was. Then during the questioning, they also asked him if this document that they found in the flat was indeed his, which is how they catch you in a lie, because then you confirm, yeah, it is. And then the detectives tell him, well, actually, we have Shirley's fingerprints on the record from her house, and the thumbprint that belonged to Shirley was actually found on this document that is within your house. So there's definitely no way for you to deny that this has happened. Like, her car is in your garage, her thumbprint is in your house. You have held Shirley Banks, and also then what you have to think about is that she was alive the next day. Whatever had happened during the day, during the night, and then the next day he made her call in to work. And he probably, knowing the type of individuals that do this, told her that he is going to let her live. Like, the sheer horror that Shirley must have been going through as this was happening is just insane. To make you believe that you're going to live if you, just keep your voice calm, call in to work as if you were sick, make them buy into the story for you just to be killed later. That wouldn't be the most morbid part. That came once Shirley's body would be found 6 months after, in a stage of decomposition, in this area in Quantock Hills that was called Dead Woman's Ditch. And the post-mortem would reveal that she was repeatedly hit over her head with a rock, and the police also believe that she was kept for at least 18 hours before he actually decided to kill her and then dispose of her body. That woman's ditch will come up later in the story, so just pin that in your head, and also just pin it in your head because why? Are you having a stroke there? Even when you Google this place, one of the first 3 images, like the little square that you see of like, oh, choose this image, like a little quick shortcut. One of the first images is a police officer searching this area with a sniffer dog, which means it's a known dumping ground. Which means, of course, because it's called Dead Woman's Ditch. Like, it's literally on the nose. Why? Why is it called like that? What BAMN named this place Dead Woman's Ditch? I will have beef with certain points of this story. I will get enraged. But at this point in our story, John Cannan is arrested. People believe that he is behind Shirley's murder because obviously her thumbprint is found in his flat and also her car, and he repainted it, changed the license plates. Why do that? Why do that? He will say that he got this car off of a businessman from Bristol, according to some sources. Again, that's too much on the nose, considering that whole theory about Suzy's disappearance would be connected to a Bristol businessman, supposedly. He will tell a lot of blatant lies about that day, and we know he didn't have the alibi. He also didn't have the alibi for the Leamington Spa day, and he was identified there. We know at this point the police has finally arrested him, they have him in custody, and he is to face trial for the murder of Shirley Banks, based off of the thumbprint and then based off of the car and the text disc that was found in his secondary vehicle, well, rather the one that didn't belong to Shirley, and also the changes that he did to Shirley's car. But at this time, because this is 1987, because the picture of his arrest, like his mugshot, started circulating the area after he was arrested in Bristol, we know that this has reached London, and people started comparing the sketch of Mr. Kipper to the pictures that they had on John Cannan. In particular, the picture that we most commonly know has been compared to Mr. Kipper, and the whole of the country basically said this photo of it shows some serious resemblance to the man in question. So the police looked into his history, And we are going to speak about that next. What in his background, if anything, could have indicated that this man was escalating, that this man could have committed Suzy's murder, could have actually had something to do with her disappearance in 1986, didn't get caught, managed to escape justice, and then a year later he would kill Shirley Banks. So who was John Cannan? He was born on February the 20th, 1954 in Sutton Coldfield, which is this area near Birmingham, I think. It's in Warwickshire, and he was born in a pretty okayish family. I would say his dad was one of the people that served in Royal Air Force during the Second World War, so he was said to be quite stern when it came to his household. His name was Cyril, at least I think that's how you pronounce it. It's way too close to the word cereal, but sure. So Cyril was quite respected in the small area of Sutton Coldfield, and he became a known salesman within the motor trade industry. He was at home considered to have some anger management issues. You know, who doesn't? Which one of us doesn't? You think this is a relatable topic, anger management instead? It's like do everything but go to therapy. Share it on your YouTube channel rather than go to therapy. His mom also was a disciplinary, but it was said like she was kind of like the intermediary between the two, you know, like when his dad would lose temper, would maybe like beat him up or like shout at young John Cannan, his mom would, you know, try to settle the situation down. He would have two other siblings, but it just seemed like his dad kind of had a pick with little Johnny, which is how he called him, and basically this kid was blamed for everything that was to happen in the house. Now, something that I haven't read anywhere was any accusations of abuse, any sort of thing that you would expect, you know, in the making of a serial rapist, serial killer, anything like that. I haven't read any of that. However, the abuse might have happened outside of the household, at least according to Cannan and his later interviews, because he started his education at the age of 4, and then he was sent to private school for boys. Now, he was, by all accounts, again, a good student, and it was kind of like, you know, the boys' school, so it was all about machismo, especially at the time. The school's policy was kids, boys do not cry. So you can kind of see how in that environment, even if something was to be happening, you wouldn't speak about it then and there. And what Cannan said happened was when he was 7 or 8, that he was told by a teacher to go into this empty classroom at the time, and then the teacher told him to drop his pants down. That he touched him, assaulted him, and wanted John to reciprocate, to do the same to the teacher. The abuse, according to Cannan, later would go on for a few months. And he would say it was something that he couldn't share with anybody, that it was dirty, horrid, and as a child who can't process really what's happening, he also felt ashamed. Because of this trauma, because he wouldn't speak about it, because he didn't get any therapy, any treatment for it, he eventually then stopped caring about school. He started skipping school and also started committing similar types of crimes that he now thought, well, this is the behavior that was displayed to me by no one else but the teacher, somebody in a role of a respected person within that school. So if this is something that can be done within school property, within school premises, why won't I do it somewhere else? So at the age of 14, he committed one of his first crimes, and it would be indecent assault. It was said that he just approached this young woman at a phone kiosk, I don't know, is it a phone booth, and then he put his hand up her skirt. His parents were obviously informed because of the police, and he would end up serving 12 months of probation for this. After that, he sort of tried to go back to school, but he ditched it eventually at the age of 17, and he joined the Merchant Navy, trying maybe to escape his overbearing father. Everything really here is speculation, but here he only stayed for about 3 months. And later he returned home in order to work with his dad. So he started working as a salesman at a company that his dad was selling cars in. During this time, people would describe Cannan as somebody who was a loner. He kind of, you could see that this trauma affected him, that he didn't speak of, but he became more and more distant. But he still had a strong sense of power. He kind of thought of himself as somebody who was entitled, you know. He was so great selling cars, and suddenly he's this hard-working, talented individual. Everything is a given to John Cannan. His friends and colleagues and literally everybody that knew Cannan at some point in his life would say that he would brag, you know, he was always saying how there's just no flaws, you know, he would brag about everything positive, there were no flaws in his life, how he would like to appear as this person with finer taste in things, this person who could speak to anybody, to any woman. And this is something to bear in mind for later, the fact that he was quite a chatterbox. He would be bragging with his colleagues at work as if they cared, that he would have over 100 one-night stands. Just imagine coming to sell cars and this guy is bragging about how many women he slept with. And I'm not really sure how the math is mathing there, because he was actually engaged for about 7 years. I mean, there is a way for math to be mathing there. Either happened before, in between, during, you get the gist, you get the gist. He probably cheated on every single woman in his life, because that is where this story goes from now on. So in 1978, he will finally marry the woman that he was engaged to for 7 years, called June Vale. Now, he married June, according to the sources, probably on the basis this was kind of a shotgun wedding thing, that June fell pregnant. Because Cannan would say that he rushed into this marriage, even though they were technically engaged for 7 years. So he got married, he had a child, and soon into this marriage he realized that it wasn't for him. So the way he started coping with it was by drinking and also making trips often to wherever, literally wherever but his own house. But mostly he would often go to Birmingham to let go of that steam. And we know that usually entails an affair or a couple. By Cannan's age of 26, so in our timeline here we are at 79, 1980, and in Suzy's timeline that would be the time that she would maybe be on the QE2 ship. It would be beginning of 80s that she was still working as a beautician on the ship and then would move to land. And that's something again to have in the back of your head, that there are no touch points between these two individuals. Suzy's family still was mostly in South London, that is where she would be living, that she would inherit her grandma's house, whereas John practically always operated in West Midlands area, Birmingham mostly, Sutton Coldfield where his family was, and didn't really have many friends, family, known contacts in London. So by his age of 26, he was already pretty much an alcoholic and has theoretically abandoned his family. So he would work for 6 days a week, he would really try to make that salesman job work. He would even sometimes commit extra time, the evenings and the weekends, in order to go to the showroom to show these cars. And then in 1980, he met another woman. He would start a relationship with her. I don't have the name, neither would I probably say it. So eventually he sort of moved out of his wife's place with this new woman. And then this woman had kids of her own, so he took the role of a stepfather without ever really wanting to have kids in the first place. With his wife, he kind of married her because she was pregnant with his child, because according to him, his wife actually forgot to take the pill. So that is why that marriage happened. But now he is in a relationship with a mistress without ever having a desire to become a stepfather, to actually have kids. And from my accounts, he's still married at this point. During the Christmas holidays in 1980, for whatever reason, John decides to actually try to reconcile his marriage. He's gonna go home, go to his wife, everything is gonna be fine. He's gonna work on that relationship because they were still married at this point, so he does that. And this is a horror story that is about to happen. During that evening, as him and his wife are, trying to rekindle the romance, are sleeping together, he places his hands around her neck in an attempt to choke her. So she starts pleading with him, saying, don't do that, you know, it's not consensual, you're gonna kill me if you continue doing that. To which he responds, I mean to kill you. I'm going to kill you. So in an attempt to free herself, she starts screaming, she's sort of starting to hit him, do anything. However, John has actually brought a plastic bag, and he starts taking contents out of it. And one of those items that he had in that bag was a gun. So he picked it up, pointed it to her face, and said, this is loaded. So thinking she was going to die, they struggled over the weapon, and then the gun fired into the wall, luckily. So she manages to, wrestle with him, to take control of that gun, throw it on the floor, and then basically try to escape that situation. However, because she is now on the floor, another item that was in his plastic bag was this vibrator. So he uses that vibrator to violate his wife. During this whole ordeal where he is attacking brutally his wife, she would space out, sometimes she would faint, and then he would basically be bringing her back to consciousness, saying, I haven't finished with you yet. She tried to escape that whole evening at the pretense of getting something out of the bathroom or simply just trying to run down the stairs, but he would beat her and just keep assaulting her that whole evening. And she wouldn't come forward with this information for the next 7 years, until she felt safe, and she only felt safe when John was behind bars. Now, if you have been paying attention by the end of part 1, you know that Shirley Banks's murder wouldn't be the only time that Cannan would face some justice and would land in prison. Rather, there was a time between 1980 and 1986 that Cannan would be spending behind bars. And that would lead to him being transferred to Wormwood Scrubs, which was in London, in Hammersmith, and that's how everything finally connects. And the crime that he will be charged for is equally a horror story, like the one that I have just told you. Because, again, he's in a ladies' knitwear shop and he's being a fucking creep. And this time, he manages to get away with a lot more. So this time he does commit both robbery and assault. This crime happened in 1981, when Joan Bradford just returned with her toddler, with her child, to her shop after a lunch break. A man walks in, he's wearing a handkerchief over his face, and at that moment the phone rings, so Jean goes to answer it. And while she turns her back to him, he pulls a knife out. He points it at her, threatening to cut her up unless she keeps quiet. He also threatened to harm the child and then placed his finger over the phone in order to disconnect that call. Because of this dynamic now, because he doesn't have two people, one to shut the door and switch the lights off, obviously somebody can walk in. And that somebody, out of all people, was Jean's own mom. But now, he has the knife to the baby, he has the knife to her daughter, so he manages to tell the mom to basically shut the lights and also shut the door. And then he proceeds to force Jean to perform oral sex on him in front of her mom. And the baby starts crying, so then he proceeds to assault Jean, who actually confirmed to him that she was pregnant with another child. Basically, he forces her from her lying down to get up so that he can sexually assault her. And at this point, because Jean's husband was actually lunching with them, so he was still outside, he starts banging on the door, figuring the lights are off, what the hell, something is going on inside of this store. So John Cannan decides to skedaddle, decides it's over, it's done. He has also stolen some cash out of this shop. And he tells Jean, before going through the back door, you might want to know about this. You'll realize later, because I'll be dead within a fortnight. Because John would steal some money and look through her purse, he also knew her address. And he would tell her not to call the police for 2 weeks, or, something is going to happen with her child. But as soon as they opened that door, they rang 999. They rang the police straight away, they gave them the description of a man who they said would be between 25 and 30, about 5 feet 10 inches tall, of medium build, with thick dark hair that they believed was naturally curly. Jean also said she believed that this man had a Birmingham accent and that it looked like he was threatening them with a Boy Scout's knife. She described the knife as well and described another distinctive feature of John Cannan, which were his dark eyebrows that sort of met across the bridge of his nose. Not enough for a unibrow, but still, they were bushy as fuck. A photo of it would be released, and a week later somebody would volunteer John Cannan to the police. Here, his house would be checked again, and they would find again different weird-ass objects that they knew he didn't use consensually, like a bullwhip, 4 lengths of rope, the letter sent to him by his then wife in 1980 after he assaulted her during Christmas. He admitted to being in the area of Jean Bradford's shop during the attack, but he just said, I can see the resemblance between me and this person, but I entered the shop and I intended to steal the money, but the rape, it just came as the afterthought, you see, because I'm not violent. I'm just not a violent person. And also, yes, I did say that, I will be dead in 2 weeks' time, but then I just didn't have the guts to end my own life. So that's why we are here. I didn't do any of this. The rape came as the afterthought. And he thought, yeah, that's gonna be a plausible excuse. Of course it wasn't. And he would here be arrested. And this is when he will be sentenced for about 8 years. And during this time, during the time of his sentencing, during the time that he would appear at Sutton Coldfield Magistrates Court in 1981, he will meet a woman called Annabel Rose. Pin this name in your head because it will become relevant later in the story. For now, what you need to know is that Annabel Rose was a solicitor. And John would obviously be placed behind bars, he would be placed in B wing, and here this is the place that is reserved for people serving 5 years or more. So in 1982, he will be behind bars and he will want to get a divorce. So Annabel was involved in his divorce proceedings. That's all you need to know for now. So in 1984, when Suzy was still a beautician, she was working at a face place. Any chance I get. The place is called Face Place. And it's a beauty shop. Move on. She was working there and apparently she told the client that she was dating a married guy from Bristol. Well, in 1984, John was still serving his sentence as a full-time inmate. I know that's weird, but we know that he gets moved to Wormwood Scrubs in Hammersmith, and here it's a day release program. So in 1984, he's still behind bars full-time. So at the time that Suzy is telling this story to this person while she's doing her eyebrows, let's say she was doing that, John Cannan was A, not married anymore, and B, he was a full-time prison inmate. And I don't know, you might call that crazy, but I don't think that a person that isn't married would use the married man card in order to get somebody to date them. I don't know, that just seems like a stretch to me. It's rather, it would be the other way around. If they're married, they would be lying, saying that they're actually divorced. But, if people want to buy into a theory, I guess they will buy into it by all means necessary. So during this time, and all the way up until January of 1986, John Cannan would be a full-time inmate. And then, in order to reintegrate him back into the society, he was moved to the pre-release hostel based in London, in Wormwood Scrubs. The exact date was 25th of January 1986, and we know he will be released out of this pre-release hostel on 25th of July. So between end of January and end of July, he was based in London. So just something for you to ruminate on, whether this amount of time was enough for this man to either integrate himself into Suzy's life somehow, meet her, consensually, voluntarily start a relationship with her, or rather to actually start stalking her and find his next target. Some sources will say that during this time he actually started another relationship with Jilly Page. From David's book and just like most sources, I know that this relationship happened after, like in 1987, sort of like before he was actually caught for Shirley Banks's murder. However, from some sources online, it is said that this is when, during his day releases, he would befriend ice skater Jilly Page. They started a relationship and they would travel together. So sometimes they would travel to a pool that is close to Bournemouth, or sometimes he would travel on his own. And at this hostel, he would have a curfew, so, wherever he was to go during the day, he would have to return at night. What we know for sure, though, because of the research done on this case, was that he had a day job. And this was also part of the reintegration into the society program. So the main reason why he was actually in this day release hostel was because of his good behavior. It was because this was designated for people who are displaying low-level violence or have been charged with low-level violence crimes, which I don't know how he fits there, but somehow he does. So during this time, he actually got a job at this prop hire company. So he was just like part-timing with them. Before any prisoner could even take part in one such scheme, they would go before the selection board, they would look into their background, the crimes that they have committed, their behavior in prison, are they close to ending the sentence, like does it all make sense? And then this would work in such a way where it would be kind of like an actual job. So they would use the money that they would earn from that job to pay for the lodgings, to pay for the pre-release hostel, and then the rest basically they could keep. And then that money, from what we probably know based off of the testimonies by Jilly Page and later investigations into it, Cannan used for women, for Jilly Page, and for his own travel expenses. That brings us to July the 25th, 1986, 3 days before Suzy's disappearance. Cannan would be released from this day release hostel from Wormwood Scrubs. Suzy goes missing, and at this point nobody is looking at John Cannan. Rather, he's just living his life as normal. He is released from hostel. He will, as we will speak in about a few minutes, say that he has actually gone to Sutton Coldfield, to his mom's house, and that is where he actually was, and the police will have that alibi on the record. They will just completely disregard it. He, by some accounts, was still seeing Annabelle Rose at this point. By some, he was seeing her and Jilly Page. He might have been involved in other crimes, but we don't have those confirmed either in his name. As you can tell, it's just a lot of murky tabloid coverage on this case. But where we do have a timestamp is on the now infamous, in this case at least infamous, dating video. So he decides, because he has been in jail for the past 6 or so years, that he needs to start looking for love. And at that point, you didn't have the apps, he didn't just go on Tinder because that wasn't available to him, which I bet if Tinder was a thing back then, John Cannan would be the first user. He'd be the guy with a freaking picture with a fish on it. Instead, he opted in for a dating agency, and there, they kind of set you up in front of a camera, they ask you a couple of questions, and you try to look alive. You try to look like, you're a decent human being who is not going to commit assault and kill a person. So during that time, they ask him what he's looking for in a woman.
Well, I think apart from the physical side, again, I think somebody who's pleasant, who's natural, who's relaxed, somebody who's calm, just pleasant, just really nice.
Career orientated?
No. Well, as somebody who's career orientated myself, I couldn't blame them for that.
Yeah.
No, not at all.
He would say he's career-oriented. Meanwhile, during this time, he would be an actual lowlife, living off of committing robberies, if not other crimes, to sustain himself. when they ask him that question of like which period would you like to be living through, if not, you know, the current one, he said Elizabethan. He uses a couple of big words that don't mean what he thinks they mean in a sentence, and people point that out, that he still, at this moment in time, even after serving prison sentence, even after he should know better, he's still pretending, he's still lying, he's still pretending to be smarter, more educated, more sophisticated than he actually was.
Kids live in any period of history. Which would you choose?
Elizabethan.
Oh, you would like to go back in time?
Yes, I think
yeah?
so, Elizabethan.
So what's it about the Elizabethans that you
I
find?
think a ruff would suit me.
Right.
Tights and a sword. I can see me on some bridge, or some galleon, being a pirate. Yes,
Yeah.
I can handle that.
And this woman in this documentary, after we literally listen through this and you're like, okay, cool. Yeah, you look for this in a woman? Great, great, you're such a catch. This woman says he comes across as an aggressive person, but still, he is well liked. Like, I can see the appeal. I'm like, how? How do we correlate these two things? Like, how is this guy getting away with this? How is he known as the ladies' man? Just pause this video now and set your standards higher. Pause this video now. If you at any point during this video found this man attractive, pause it right now, set your standards higher. Okay? We aim for Michael B. Jordans of this world, not picking John Cannans.
Very nice. I thought he was attractive, well presented. He had a smart suit on, and he came across as a very confident and probably fairly aggressive person. But I did actually quite like him.
So, in this documentary, we also hear that Suzy's parents, at this time of her disappearance, are mentioning that somebody potentially might have been stalking Suzy. In part 1, we mentioned that Nick, her lodger, said something about her receiving phone calls, her receiving flowers, but she didn't seem like super upset, or the other extreme, like super excited over them. However, her parents would say that Suzy even mentioned to them that somebody violent entered her life, but that she thought she could handle them. But the family actually thought that this might have been a serial stalker, somebody who might have done this before.
She had lots of boyfriends, but she didn't seem to like this one. This one frightened her. She told us she found a man very scary. She told us that he was giving her lots of flowers and that she kept bringing him up, and he wanted to take her out. And I said, really, do you think that's wise? Because won't it escalate? And she said, no, Mum, I can cope. And I think that the likelihood is that she was a victim of somebody who was a serial stalker. In those
We
days,
had, unfortunately, Susan gave us no information to identify anybody.
I feel like you will either leave this video believing in this stalker theory, that between January and July it was enough time for Cannan to be in London, for him to be scouting the area for his next target. But what you need to then take into that equation was that he would also be having to be on the lookout for a disposal area, because Suzy's body to this day has never been found. So either he has been sitting on this secret, has been, planning this has all been premeditated, or he has had the perfect disposal spot in his head for quite some time. Before that, he was sitting in jail for a long time. He definitely had the time to really think about how he will commit this. Or you will end up leaving this video thinking that every single crime, when you think about John Cannan and sort of his criminal history, didn't have much forethought going into it. That they were all crimes of opportunity. Maybe, yes, he was in the area and he would see these women, he would know where the shop is, maybe he would lurk around. Possibly, yes, there was potential for stalking for every single one of his crimes, but just by the planning, just by how quickly he would get caught, just by every single one being able to identify his face, his features, it just doesn't seem like he put much thought process into any of them. But in our timeline now, for sure we know in 1987 he is dating a woman called Shirley Page. We know the relationship happened during the summer and then it continued into autumn. And Shirley Page had no idea that while she's dating John Cannan, he is in the process of being tried for murder. So let us pick back up within that timeline now in 1987 on Cannan and Shirley Banks's trial. Here, he would actually be charged with 16 offenses, because apparently, even after Suzy's disappearance, in October of 1986, he was linked via DNA to yet another rape, this time in Reading, because we know he loved to travel. He loved to travel in those areas for, again, whatever reason, so he has definitely been linked to one other rape. Another set of charges would be brought against him for 1 year after that, him being the believed man who attempted the abduction of a woman at a gunpoint. And then the third incident that he will be brought into court for would be abduction and murder of Shirley Banks. I couldn't find much detail on the other two events. You let me know if you know more in the comments, but basically there were 16 charges being brought against them. And the prosecution's theory was that John would have abducted Shirley on the night that she went missing, and then overnight he held her in his flat, asked her, well, probably with a gun to her head, asked Shirley to ring in to her workplace in order to call in sick the next day, and pretended that he was going to release her. As we know, there will be the thumbprint in his house, and then Shirley's car that he had repainted and changed the license plate to, and then the text disc from his car to connect him to Shirley. And there was also semen found on the scene of the other crime, of the rape from October of 1986. And as if that wasn't enough, one of his previous lovers, Annabelle Rose, decided to turn on him, and she testified against him. Now, she had full-blown reason to testify against this man. So, Annabelle Rose had an affair with Cannan that, according to sources, lasted about 11 months, and it ended in August of 1987. And then between August of 1987 and October of 1987, which, as we know in our timeline during this investigation, was the time when the dots started being connected between the Bristol police and the police here in London. When suddenly everybody was making connections between the mugshot and the pictures of John Cannan after the arrest for Shirley Banks' murder, and the photo of it for Suzy Lamplugh suspect was seen at the Shorrolds Road. Well, during that time, John Cannan was making Annabelle Rose's life a living hell. So Annabelle was married during her affair with John Cannan. So after she probably broke this relationship off, let's just be honest, because all of the women that even gave this man a chance were way out of his league, he started to threaten her. He suggested that he knew where her parents lived because John Cannan hired a private detective to follow her around. So he suggested he knew the address of the parents, that he is going to come forward with the information of the affair to her husband, that he's basically going to harm her family, that he's going to expose her unethical practices to like the law society, and all of that. So, of course, she definitely had a reason once there was a chance for this man to be put behind bars to testify against him. Because of her testimony to his character, because the defense really didn't have much to work with here, because of all of the overwhelming evidence and the criminal history just showing that this man is a creep and a serial rapist at this point, the jury only took 10 hours of deliberation. They have found him guilty of abducting and murdering Shirley Banks and other 6 charges of rape, burglary, abduction, and attempted kidnapping. And he got a full term. He got a life sentence in prison, which here, from what I've seen, is 35 years. With Cannan now behind bars, let us go back in time in order to play out the theory in which Cannan was behind Suzy Lamplug's disappearance. After the 25th of July 1986, where was he after he was released from the hostel, and even before that, what was he doing in the months between January and July while Suzy got her job at Sturgis, while she was just doing her day-to-day tasks, and while she was just enjoying her weekend, attending a friend's birthday party, changing her hair color, and just living her best life before the Monday, before she would make those 3 diary entries. So, to start that off, you would probably want to know whether or not John Cannan had an alibi for the day of Monday, the 28th of July. And according to David's book, he did. And the police knew about it, and they just completely disregarded it. Now, on the surface, this isn't the strongest alibi in the books, because according to the book, John Cannan, after his release from Wormwood Scrubs in Hammersmith, went to Sutton Coldfield, to his mom. He spent his time from Friday onwards with his mom in Sutton Coldfield. This would make sense, but a lot of people would say, well, of course, his mom is going to corroborate something like this. But then, because this is 1986, and you remember, John Cannan had that job, because everybody in this hostel, in order to reintegrate with the society, would have the job on the side. Well, David dug up a reference for that job, and according to the person behind the reference, he literally found their details, he rang them up, and this person, again, 30 plus years later, did remember John Cannan. They remember leaving the positive reference, so they think that this was done by him, like it wasn't forged by John himself. Now, what he remembers is actually physically handing over that reference to Cannan on Friday, just after his release, because of course he's gonna go home to his mom. He needs to find another job now that he's out. And he remembers Cannan mentioning something like him going back to Sutton Coldfield in order to visit his mom, and like, where was he going to live if not there? It just all made sense to this person. I'll put a reference on the screen. As I mentioned, David actually rang this guy. He even put like a transcript of that phone call as well in the book. So according to David, this did happen, and the police just completely disregarded that it did. About the actual Monday in question, Cannan corresponded with David, and he said that his mom provided a Met with a simple alibi for 28th of July, that they were in Birmingham nearly all day, and that had the Met acted quicker, his sister and brother-in-law would have provided 100% watertight corroboration. But now both of them are sadly dead, because again, 32 plus years have passed. But what he does remember was how frustrated and surprised they all felt by how slow the Met Police was going at the time. So having that in mind, having in mind another myth that I hope I busted during this video, that Cannan was still married in 1984, which David confirms he was not. He had already been divorced by that point, that he didn't really have any connection to Bristol for him to be the Bristol businessman that Suzy would have spoken about. What other myths are there that are left for us to disperse? Well, after Suzy's disappearance, there would be all of these witness testimonies, eyewitness testimonies about potential vehicle. Maybe Suzy was seen inside of it, maybe she was seen being put into it with force. There was one that I remember which was saying that Suzy was inside arguing with somebody, and that this vehicle was a BMW. We know from the previous story about his background that Cannan did own a BMW in 1987, but he did not own it before that.
In 1986, the day Suzy disappeared, he saw a woman with blonde hair struggling with a man in a BMW.
And I came out of the park to be met by a BMW, which tore across the road, come to a halt with somebody with their hand on the hooter, pressing it for a very long time. As I stood there, I saw a blonde young lady. She looked as though she was laughing, or she could have been screaming. What worried me, was How could she drive with what was going on? Well, it never occurred to me that it was a left-hand drive car.
Between January and July of 1986, in this pre-release hostel, Cannan would end up having a strict curfew. He would be able to get out of this hostel at 7 a.m., or rather after 7 a.m., and he will have to get back for the head count, for them to basically check everybody's in bed, by 11 p.m. And during that time, he only had the budget to basically pay for another car, and he split the cost and then the use of that car with another inmate. And the car in this case was a red Ford Sierra. So basically with another inmate they used to split this car in order to get between the job that they would be employed at and also then to come back to the hostel in time. And the important thing here that David confirmed with one of the officers that he had questioned that worked on Suzy's case was that Suzy's DNA was never found in this car. So if we are supposing that he only has one vehicle that he can use and Suzy's vehicle has been found, that means that the other vehicle would have to be used by him in order to transport her body wherever we're saying he's transporting that body. Either that or, suspicions would be raised by this other person that he's sharing that vehicle with, or literally on the day of the release, Friday, he would have enough money to then, between then and that Monday, get another vehicle, get a getaway vehicle, and also think about the disposal spot and also find Suzy right at the time in broad daylight, and that is going to be the only time that he's going to decide this is the perfect timing for an attack. And what I think mostly goes against Cannan leaving this hostel during the day and elaborating this whole plan for about 6 months, like why I think it's not really probable, is that suddenly this guy who has been known for his whole life for being a chatterbox, for being a brag, for being a blabbermouth, telling people how many women he has slept with, telling people about literally everything, getting caught every single time, is now doing all of this in silence, without telling anybody, without anybody figuring out something shady as fuck is going on. As we have all of the details for the puzzle now and have broken probably a couple of myths that you have heard all along about the BMW, about him being married in 1984, that he couldn't have been the businessman from Bristol in 1984 because he was in prison full-time, and before that as well there were no touch points between these two individuals. So we are to believe that within the last 6 months of Suzy's life, Cannan got out of full-time imprisonment. He would go between Hammersmith and Fulham area, he would get fixated on Suzy for some reason, and then on that day he was responsible for her disappearance. In order for that to have happened, he would, without anyone's knowledge, have to lurk in the area when he is supposed to be working again, and while Suzy is surrounded by her colleagues, and none of them mentioned any of that, as you remember from part 1. On the day of his release, or before, he would need to rent another vehicle, or have the area nearby somehow where he is to dispose of Suzy's body, if he is not using a third-party kind of vehicle. Then his alibi would have to be incorrect. He would spend the weekend in London or somewhere else without anyone's knowledge, who had no loyalties to this man. Like, none of the people in his life seem to have had any loyalties to him so far, but suddenly either he's really great at keeping secrets or people just aren't snitching. He maybe encounters Suzy, maybe thinks she wrote something in his diary to incriminate him. He might pretend to be a potential buyer and then arranges to meet up with her. He might have introduced himself as Mr. Kipper, and then on Monday he has that appointment arranged with her where he lures her and then attacks. Somehow then he gets himself to West Midlands and is suddenly the smartest criminal the UK has ever seen. The man that cut himself while running from the police and had a knife with an orange handle while committing a crime. The man who, despite escalating, got caught every single time. I don't think I have to spell it out what my opinion in this case is, but do I think that Cannan did it? No. You let me know what you think about that in the comments. I just don't buy it. I just don't believe that this man had a noggin to do it. Sorry to say, especially because he's gonna be released and probably look for like people that have covered Suzy Lamplug's disappearance, and he might find me. He's still alive, he's still kicking. But yeah, I just don't think that this man who got caught every single time suddenly is a mastermind. I don't buy it, but there will probably be people disagreeing with me in the comments. You can do that, I don't mind. I can debate. I can debate on this one. I think I have substantial amount of information to debate on this topic. But before speaking of where we left the investigation off, picking up on some crucial points, David kept mentioning 3 cases in his book. One of them well, 2 of them I was actually familiar with, but the third one is very niche. But basically all of these cases that he mentioned highlight failures of the police. And all of them happened either before or after Suzy's disappearance, a sort of similar decade that we are talking about here. And I'm just going to outline all 3 of them, and you'll see if you can spot any similarities in the 3 cases that he mentioned, and what was going on when it comes to the investigation, and what we will speak about from this point on about Suzy's investigation. Yorkshire Ripper, who was later found out to have been Peter Sutcliffe, operated between 1975 and 1980. Murdering 13 women. Well, 13 victims have been confirmed. It is suspected that he murdered at least 22 women. And why I say that it has only been discovered later that this was Peter Sutcliffe, because for the longest time the police was blindsided by a person pretending to be the serial killer. This guy, who was known as Wareside Jack, would later be found out to be a guy under the name John Humble, who pretended to be a killer and for more than a year was leaving hoax letters and audio tapes that convinced the police that they were looking for a man with a completely different accent. This is so creepy. It's like cats screaming for their dear life. I don't know, it's so eerie. This is so eerie, guys. It would take a criminal profiler, an FBI criminal profiler, and the squad that would analyze dialects in order for the detectives to finally be convinced that this man is not in fact Peter Sutcliffe, that this wasn't in fact Yorkshire Ripper. So for 5 years, just the police in this case completely had tunnel vision. Again, same thing like here, focus on an individual that again they're proving over and over again isn't the person they're looking for. And after this, in 1981, Byford report has been issued because a guy under the name Lawrence Byford, who was the chief inspector of constabulary, requested an official inquiry into the investigation to see what the fuck have they been doing. This report requested some big changes in policing, development of a computer system in order to collate information, in order for everything that was done manually now to be submitted online. And also it gave police access to various databases. But David here in the book speaks of how, despite of this report, people with no experience were still left in charge. And that is something that the report highlights. And in Suzy's case, you can really see that. You can see that with the switch of the detectives around December of 1986, where, you know, one of them retired and then the other one took the case. David speaks of also the other workload, that they were juggling quite a few investigations at the time. And he points out to the newly appointed office manager inside of the incident room, never having experience in that role before. The second case that he highlights in the book is the one of Stephen Lawrence. In April of 1993, a Jamaican teenager growing up in southeast London was brutally murdered by 2 people that will not face justice for almost 20 years. He was just waiting at a bus stop with his friend when 2 people attacked them. His friend managed to escape unhurt, but Stephen was stabbed several times, managing to run away from the scene, but then bleeding to death. Because they were disgusted by how this case was treated, mostly because of institutional racism in this case, Stephen's parents had to fight for him. They have to actually complain for something to be done. And here, yet again, another report has been issued, which is under the name of Macpherson Report, and it was issued in 1999. And according to the report, the investigation into the killing was marred by a combination of professional incompetence, institutional racism, and the failure of leadership. There were specific officers in the Met Police that were named, and the entire force was criticized. But what this complaint and investigation resulted in was the banning of the double jeopardy law. And that meant that two people will finally face justice, Gary Dobson and David Norris, because they could finally face trial again, following the discovery of the footage of them making racist remarks and also discovery of forensic evidence. However, as I mentioned, this would happen a lot later than it should have, and also the family here, just like with the Lamplughs, had to pull all the strings, had to literally put all of the arsenal in place in order for the police to just do the basic work. Just the basic work, because here again the suspects were in the limelight as and when this crime had happened. But again, were tried, there wasn't enough evidence because of the poor police work, and then laws literally had to be changed in order for these two individuals to be charged. The last case that David mentions in his book is quite niche. There's very limited information online, but is fitting into a theory that then he later proposes. And that is the case of Joanne Addison. Joanne was 15 in May of 1996 when she went missing on her way home from school. Even though immediate searches were organized, her body won't be found until 2 months later. And this happened in summer, between May and July, so even when the police found her, she would be severely decomposed, and they couldn't even determine the cause of death. But that's not it. It is because of where Joanne's body was found that, again, severe inquiries had to be made into how the police had actually investigated this crime, because Joanne was found 100 yards away from her home. So what happened here was that the British Transport Police was asked to search the area, and 5 officers from the Met Police and 5 from the BTP actually would end up in shit because of this. They would end up getting formal warnings or advice, and 1 British Transport Police officer faced a disciplinary charge, because the consequence of it was that eventually they would bring charges against a guy called Liam Towell, but he will only be able to be charged for manslaughter, because due to the delay of finding Joanne's body, it meant it was impossible to determine the cause of death. And you have to think about what would happen if Suzy's body was found now. Would we, just from the skeletal remains, just from the bones, be able to tell what the cause of death was? And also, did someone manage to hide it for so long, or would it have been possible the police didn't even look in some of the most logical places? If you were to spot any similarities, any patterns here in every single case that David outlines in this book, it seemed like police is always looking for a crime. And even if you think about, I was thinking during research of Suzy Lamplug's case into like any recent missing people cases, like, and obviously Sarah Everard's case came to mind. It's just as if the police here hears a missing person and has no clue, like, where do we begin? How do we begin? And the inclination is to start thinking a crime, what crime happened here? And that just makes zero sense to me, because you can't deal with the cases where you know a homicide happened, you know exactly what crime happened, and a missing persons case in the same way. Otherwise, you don't solve any missing persons cases. And even if you look at, like, I don't know, list of 15 unsolved cases here in the UK, you will probably spot the exact same mistakes, because they happen early in the investigation, and then you can't back out from them. As you now know what mistakes you can expect out of this investigation, or at least you think, you know, because there's a big one coming up that I did not expect when reading this book, and I'm so grateful for David for writing it. Let's pick up where we left off last time, with Cannan's arrest. We know in July of 1986, Suzy will disappear after supposedly going out to show the property to a Mr. Kipper. Then, in December 1986, Suzy Lamplugh Trust would be established by her parents. It would campaign for a safer society in order to reduce violence against individuals at home and at work.
Trust? This is a national organization born out of their own loss that campaigns for a safer society. As a result of what happened to Suzy, the Trust campaigns to reduce violence against individuals at home and at work.
And yes, on the surface, when you listen to these interviews by her parents and you think, well, is the premise on the back of Suzy being stalked? Is the premise for this trust on the back of a particular crime happening because of the flowers being sent to her home, her getting odd calls? Even if none of that is true, the mission still stands. Even if none of that is true, this trust has been there for 30 plus years, doing really great work. There's advice on their YouTube channel, there's advice on their website about literally tips for being stalked, tips for what to do in different situations. I would really recommend investing some time to, I don't know, donate to it, just go, educate yourself if you are in that situation, because that's what it's there for, regardless of what happened to Suzy. As we know from what I mentioned last week, the investigation will die down. The only thing they would have is that photo fit, that sketch, that would be on the back of Harry Ringling's eyewitness testimony. And he would be able to describe Mr. Kipper, to describe the person that was in front of his house, but he really couldn't describe Suzy. So on the back of that, you have to wonder, was Suzy the person that was there? Or was this a completely different person? Were they just standing outside of the property because these were two individuals that were just standing and talking, having small talk on the street? And after that, the case was pretty much closed. But then something happened that would remain this investigation open. And here is where everything finally aligns in people's heads. So the Lamplughs got legal representation as soon as Suzy went missing. They hired this guy called Sir David Napley, and this guy, if you Google him, he is one of those high-profile cases solicitors. Even just a quick Google search can tell you that the man is controversial. One of the first titles that pops up of an article is "Star Solicitor Helped VIP Avoid Pedophilia Prosecution." So how does this all connect? So on the surface, they hired Sir David Napley and they would hire another expert in libel cases in order to try and basically protect Suzy's integrity, you know, so that nothing from the personal diaries actually reaches the public. So they did well on both of those fronts, and seemingly it is understandable, you know, you don't want your daughter to be portrayed in a certain way in the news, and you do want to protect your family, to know what you should be saying in those press conferences and stuff when looking for your daughter. But then David, when he published this book, uncovered possibly a sinister motivation for something like this to be in place. Rather, there was possibly a whole subplot, a whole underlying conspiracy theory, if you wish, that was going on. Because Sir David Napley was actually related to Annabel Rose. From the book, I got that they were some distant cousins, but still, Caroline managed to actually get up like the, you know, family tree, and she was like showing David around. I wish I had the pictures, I wish I had that. Maybe it is somewhere online and I'm glitching, but Caroline doing the God's work again. Caroline just doing the God's work yet again, put some respect to Caroline's name. So why does this matter? And how does it all connect? Going back in time, because there's so much information in this video, so I wouldn't blame you on forgetting things. Annabel had an affair with John Cannan in 1987. That affair ended ugly. And Cannan basically hired a private detective, threatened to expose her, and then threatened to go to her work, basically to say that she wasn't working in an ethical way. Both Napley, so the legal representative for the Lamplughs, and Annabelle were in law society. Napley was actually like the head of it, or like the chair of it. He was one of the top people. So David suggests it wouldn't be crazy to think that Annabelle would resort to going to this man for advice on like, how do I deal with this fucking psychopath? What should I do? And timing-wise, this was happening in 1987, just as Cannan was to be tried for Shirley Banks's murder. So, if we are to assume that he was a pain in the ass for Annabelle, did he really come up as a suspect in this case out of nowhere? Or, these two knew each other, Sir David Napley started representing the Lamplughs, and suddenly Annabelle thought, why don't I get rid of him? Or one of them planted a seed. This is very much speculation, but out of all of the speculative information in this case, this is the one where I'll be like, you know what? I'm buying into it. It's two birds with one stone, because for the Lamplughs, they finally have a suspect that the police has been also offering up now, that can make sure that the investigation is open, they can actually look into him, investigate him, charge him for the daughter's murder. They would have closure, they would have resolution, and then for Annabelle, she can have him behind bars. She can have this past, like literally charged for life, she can testify in his court proceedings, she can basically make sure that he's never a thorn in her back ever again. And this next part is simply a byline. It is literally a single paragraph in David's book, and I was like, David, where are you going with this? David, there's no evidence to support this. David, why are you putting this into my head? And there are probably people out there who think that this might be true. And again, it is just speculative, right? But we know from all of the things that we have spoken about Cannan's background, like, we know that he is a rapist, we know that that is his MO, but we also know that, like, from the previous attacks that he had on these women, it just seemed like a crime of opportunity. He wanted to rob them, he wanted to sexually assault them, he wanted to be violent, but he actually never killed them, even though he technically could have. He technically could have immediately just sprung that knife and killed the victim. And then suddenly there is that escalation with Shirley Banks, and that resulted in one of the more brutal murders in the UK. And when you think about where that lines up in 1987, when he knew Annabelle, and then Annabelle testifying in his trial, and then, her connection with Sir David Napley, David suggests, what if, some evidence might have been planted here. Well, he doesn't really spell it out that way, but that's the way that I got. And there's nothing in the book connected Annabelle to any of this. There's nothing saying that she had planted, that she would have been able to do this, because again, nobody really looked into it. But if she did have an affair with him, did she ever have keys to his house? Was there anything there? I think this is the part of the story that we will just never know. If any of the parts of the story, this is the one where I would just go insane inside of myself when it comes to this speculation, because there is basis for it. There is basis for it when it comes to that connection with the legal representation and Annabelle Rose, and we just never will know of it. And on the surface, it seemed like they did have enough evidence that was, not even just circumstantial, but rather like, why would Shirley Banks's thumbprint be in this man's flat? Why would her car be there? Why would he have her text disc in her car? Again, just speculation, but literally he plants a seed into my head, this guy David, and his researcher Caroline, and now I can't stop thinking about this. I literally am going insane thinking about, well, there was an underlying plot here. But from what David says in the books, everybody could have benefited off of this. So for the Lamplughs, Cannan represented someone that the police had to investigate. So a reason that they have to reopen Suzy's investigation, which I'm not saying that anything sinister is happening here, as in that they are basically wanting to accuse an innocent man. They want to reopen their daughter's investigation. And this is now offering them an in. This is offering them an entry to it. Then, for Sir David Napley, Cannan was someone who was causing trouble for the whole Napley family. Someone who was in the process of damaging Annabel Rose's career and possibly his own reputation. His arrest and incarceration would provide all parties to get, even temporarily, what they wanted. In the beginning, the police in Bristol struggled to find any evidence to charge Cannan with anything other than the theft of Shirley Banks's car. And even if charged with that, he would probably get bail and get out. But then, suddenly, News of the World newspaper became aware of Cannan's name, his previous criminal convictions, everything we spoke about when they started investigating it. And then, this took place during the very same day that Diana started pleading with the Met Police's Deputy Assistant Commissioner, Paul Condon, that I mentioned in part 1, to reopen the case. She claimed that if he didn't reopen the case, there would be questions raised about the police cover-up, and investigation can be discussed and reach the House of Commons. The person that was heading the investigation, Detective Hackett, at the time, refused to consider Cannan as a viable suspect. But then, because of Sir David Napley, because it was suddenly circulating in the news, they shifted gears and the investigation would end up being reopened, which poses a question about who was in charge of this investigation, and poses the precedent for the rest of this long-ass video. Was it Diana? Was it the police? Or was it somebody else who wanted the parents and the police to have the answer that they wanted? What this would mean was that in the height of all of the press conferences, in the height of suddenly learning off of the back of Byford report, learning off of the back of every other inquiry into the police procedures, they started obviously putting more and more media onto this. And this happened as soon as basically the photo of it was out, as soon as this connection was made by News of the World. And suddenly, there was a lot of media presence, and all of it was about John Cannan being Mr. Kipper. And what that meant was that all of the other investigative methods just fell through. Prime example for that was who handed over the items from the pub to the police and how. Because according to Clive and people that David had interviewed for the book, there was no time that was logged here in terms of when the police was called, and the pub workers also said that they kind of heard about Suzy's disappearance. So nobody even looked into this. Nobody even looked into Suzy making calls, losing the items, planning to collect them at some point that day. If not during her lunch break, then after 6 p.m. Nobody looked into that until the pub workers heard, oh, Suzy, the person that was supposed to pick up the items, is missing. We should probably alert the police. And that's how they learned about it. It just goes to say how everything else fell through. Everything else was background noise. And they just simply focused on that one single diary entry. And they focused on John Cannan being Mr. Kipper. And while that is happening, her parents are desperately trying to salvage Suzy's reputation and also find clues. So, as I mentioned, they hired this guy who was an expert in libel cases, the lawyer called Peter Carter Ruck. According to the book, they did this because libel doesn't apply to the dead. And even though Suzy won't be declared dead by 1994, still people assumed that she was, and that as such she can't actually file any libel claims against them. So the media was going wild with anything that they would find. They were exaggerating literally every single thing. But this meant that Diana, the force of this investigation, immediately jumped on it. This lawyer would even get her ex-boyfriends, Suzy's ex-boyfriends, to sign DNA in order not to be able to have a bleep about this. And not just that, but at one stage they even involved the police in order to pass on the message. So in 1998, Paul Condon, the Met's assistant commissioner, had been forced, quote unquote, to say publicly, "It is not the policy of the force to make moral judgments about the lifestyle of victims of crime. However, in view of intense publicity about Suzy Lamplugh and her family, we feel honor-bound to say that our investigations revealed nothing more than that Suzy was a modern young woman." So what Diana managed to achieve was that personal diaries won't be talked about, or rather won't be talked about as much as they probably would have, because there was a whole ass lawyer that will keep people accountable for that. And even now, if you look anything up, like I try to look something up to be like, where was the basis for this? Because it's just a known fact, but that's all it is. I couldn't find any of her personal diaries, I couldn't find any of the entries. That's because they did such a good job at this. And for this, I mean, I have such huge respect for the Lamplugh family, but to achieve something like this, even back then, like, just imagine how hard, how insanely hard that is. Especially just the two family members running this whole operation, trying to protect their daughter's integrity at all costs. But despite of the Lamplugh family working so tirelessly to keep the clues coming, to keep her name alive, in 1994, Suzy Lamplugh would be declared dead. And the death certificate would record 28th of July of 1986 as her day of death. But this, I feel, from everything I've read, this declaration of death will just add fuel to Diana's already burning, already sizzling fire. That fire was already going on, and this would just add fuel to it. Because between 94 and 99, Diana became a powerful force, mostly through Suzy Lamplugh's trust. And that brings us to where this investigation goes from this point on. So Diana would be named an OBE. She was actually awarded the Order of the British Empire in 1992 in the recognition for her achievements through the trust. She was the sitting member of several parliamentary committees, and she would basically host like secretaries and people from the parliament in her home. So at this point, one of the three things happened, and people are saying that again, Diana was the driving force between this. So let's see which one you believe in the most. So there are three potential reasons for the investigation to keep moving again. And the police, at least from what I got from this book, always needed a motive. They always needed a probable cause for, you know, let's say digging somebody's garden or searching a location, which is understandable. But then when you realize where this story goes, you kind of think, what was the probable cause in this case? Like, this is the basis that you used? I don't really buy it every single time. You let me know if I'm missing on a couple of things. One of the possible probable causes was the relationship with Shirley Page. So it was said that they spoke with her multiple times throughout the investigation into Suzy Lamplugh. And the first time that they spoke with her was in 1991. And apparently, she kept this information on the down low for 5 years. And on the 5th anniversary of Suzy's disappearance, she came through with the information that actually Cannan, during their dating time and after Suzy's disappearance, drove her to this area near Norton Barracks, and that here he confessed that he raped and murdered the estate agent. And he kind of said it in a way of like, well, do you want to be next? So this was like during their argument, and this is how Cannan decided to settle it. The police never really gave any credence to this, mostly because she came forward with this information on the anniversary, like 5 years later, and they would interview Shirley going back and forth. So in 1999, either one of these interviews with Shirley would get them to actually search Norton Barracks, or there was another special case that came forward. There was an anonymous source from prison education system that was corresponding with Diana, and this man suggested a general site of burial. Burial? Burial. Move on. Graham McGrady Hunt. I can't find who this person is online, so the book gives us a bit about him. He did spend time in the summer of 1999 running evening classes for prospective prison staff at a prison service college. So he was in the prison system, but probably not in a way that you would expect this man to be, meaning he didn't have anything to do with prisoners. And that was kind of the implication in the media for him to be actually contacting Diana to give any sort of credence to what he was about to say. He would be the person to rekindle the Norton Barracks rumor, and then obviously the police had to have some probable cause in order to get a warrant. So this man's theory, first of all, when I say I don't know who this man is because I googled him. And the one thing you can find about him is his book. He wrote a book on Suzy that is purely on this theory that I'm about to break down for you. And the book has like 10 Amazon reviews and they're all questionable. One review says no probs. Listen, if I ever write a book and your review to it as my mate, because who else would write a review on a random ass Amazon book and would be like no probs? What does that mean? What does that give me? Nothing. So it's the range between no probs and then keep your mind open. Why would this theory be so unbelievable? Because it's insane. His theory was that the man who killed Suzy, wasn't John Cannan. It wasn't Fred West. You thought that was gonna go there, no? It wasn't Rose West either. It was Fred West's brother, John. Why? John West. What is John West? It's a brand of tuna. What is Kipper? Herring. Still, it's a brand of fish. I am not joking. I am not joking. This was this man's theory. When I read this, I was like, am I gonna include this? As you can tell from the built-up frustration in my voice that I'm trying to conceal, in my belief, this is the Reddit Fred theory that nobody even upvotes, but this man thought that this is worthy of Suzy's parents. So he actually reached out to the parents that are desperate in finding their daughter with this bullshit fucking theory, and he wasn't done yet because he didn't come to the police with this BTW, stop with the BTWs, but according to McGrady Hunt, in 1996 he actually picked up a hitchhiker on the M5, and this hitchhiker told him that she basically was in the presence, that she was picked up by this builder from Gloucester, and this builder confessed to her that he had killed a missing woman from London and that he buried her in a makeshift grave at Norton Barracks in Worcestershire. Now, he doesn't mention this to the police, but then in 1992, Fred West gets arrested. And now McGrady Hunt makes the connection to Fred West and the story of the hitchhiker because Fred West was a builder, but his brother wasn't. So what? Ah, this guy is so exhausting, so dumb. And once David briefs his researcher and the living legend that is Caroline on this, she kind of explodes. She's like, well, this isn't how investigations are run. Why is the police allowing for this to happen? Why are the tips going to Diana directly, especially tips that are so stupid like this one? And then also, who is again running the investigation? Is it Diana? Is it the police? Why is the police letting it happen? Again, I am never going to blame this on the Lamplughs. Diana, Paul, never any of them. The police shouldn't have been allowing for something like this to happen. Now, on to the third and the most accepted reason of why Norton Barracks were actually searched. And that was that the police was actually looking at cold cases. They started reinvestigating them and they picked a couple of high-profile ones, and Suzy's one fit the bill.
So next, a decision was made to search for Suzy's body. Chief Inspector Jim Dickey hoped this would yield a DNA link to Cannan. The police began looking at Norton Barracks, first named 10 years earlier by ice skater Gilly Page. It was the area detectives Barley and Addy had once suggested was worth searching.
Well, it's an experience which I'm not exactly looking forward to. I mean, I know she's dead. I know she was dead long ago. I don't exactly relish finding out what precisely happened.
We might feel that we were very relieved, and we might feel that it was very nice to be able to put Suzy to sleep.
Whichever one of those three stories you want to believe, Diana gaining power, Shirley being re-interviewed in the media, McGrady Hunt coming forward in 1999 with the John West story, the police simply couldn't ignore John Cannan and the way that he was in and out of the limelight for all of these years. They either had to eliminate or implicate him, and you can guess which route they will choose to follow. And once he was back in the news, Cannan just never left. I'll put on the screen the amount of searches that were done in any area that was ever associated with Cannan. From Quantock Hills, which was the dead woman's ditch, to Norton Barracks, which came from the McGrady dude, and then the Sutton Coldfield, which would be his family home. So you would see titles when it came to tabloids, when it came to online sources at this point, because this was now from 2000s onwards, stating that they are searching the area, that they're using ground penetrating radar, and the expectations were that finally the mystery of Suzy's disappearance will be solved. What nobody will bother to explain is just how unlikely it is, looking at these locations, all of them 100+ miles from London, how unlikely it would be for him to drive to them on the day, make sure to dispose of the vehicle or to clean it, to dispose of Suzy's body. How would he have done that? Nobody ever bothers to explain that. And even though during these searches nothing was found, in 2002 there will be a police conference. And this is the one, if you're familiar with this case, that you most likely have seen. During this conference, the police would name John Cannan as the only suspect that ever existed in the investigation into Suzy Lamplugh. They would announce that there was insufficient evidence to bring a prosecution, though. And the Met Police apologized for significant opportunities that were missed during the original inquiry.
But in spite of the new evidence, the Crown Prosecution Service, in a dramatic statement, informed the police there wasn't enough evidence to send John Cannan to trial.
As a result of the reinvestigation into the murder of Suzy Lamplugh, we submitted a file of evidence to the CPS in June of this year, recommending a prosecution. They recently advised us that they felt we had insufficient evidence at this time.
This is a defining moment for our family. We are greatly distressed and indeed considerably angered that after all these years, it is still not possible to prosecute the person who both we and the police believe murdered Suzy.
And as David puts it in this book, none of the police teams understood the underlying dynamics, because Diana and Paul didn't know that Sir David Napley and Annabel Rose are related. They failed to see the malignant interests of Sir David Napley in the background and the connections that lurked beneath the surface, which are revealed for the first time here. It is probably right to assume that Diana and Paul had no idea that their trusted solicitor had links to the suspect they would insist was responsible for Suzy's murder. And there was a whole different complication, a whole different explanation for why this conference happened and for the reason why they still, regardless of them actually digging all of these areas and never finding anything relating John Cannan to Suzy Lamplugh's disappearance, why they still proceeded to name him a prime suspect. And that was that Diana was ill. In 2003, not longer after they announced that Cannan was the prime suspect here, Diana suffered a major stroke. And later it would be released to the public that, during this operation they discovered that she did have Alzheimer's, and she had also done for some time. And later publicly they would state that Diana also had early onset dementia. and they suspected that this came because she fell off the horse in the 50s, and then, you know, part of her body was always injured, but they suspected that, you know, she started sort of losing sense, not really knowing sometimes what she was saying, and being really brisk with reporters, even with people who were there to help to find Suzy because of that. So David suggests it might not be a stretch that during this press conference they did name Cannan the prime suspect in order to satisfy Suzy's mom during that day in the auditorium, in order to offer the family some closure. In the following years, as they continue their searches and as Diana steps down from Suzy Lamplug's trust in 2003, and then Paul follows suit and steps down to look after her, the police will make 3 searches to Cannan's mom's house. They will take place in 2003, 2004, and then recently in 2018. And why they will have to search 3 times is, according to David, at least one of those times, they only search the patio. They didn't search the full freaking location. Now tell me, how does this make sense? I understand it is because of the limitations of the search warrant, but how does this make sense? If you really think this is the man, if this is the whole process in place to eliminate or incriminate this man, and then you search only part of the house, well, if he is guilty, he is in prison, so like his mom or whoever is there will then make sure to inform him that this has been searched, and then to, I don't know, transport the body somewhere else. If the body of Suzy's was there to begin with, it wouldn't be in 2018. Just doesn't make sense, like so many other things in this story. Between 2006 and 2008, the police will finally find possible clues that will connect Suzy's disappearance to somebody else but Cannan. And let me just tell you immediately, they will ignore this. And I even can't find online like how did they make this connection. But there was another serial killer here that was then arrested and prosecuted in 2008. And during that prosecution of the person called Steve Wright, who was convicted of murdering 5 sex workers in Suffolk, I think he was dubbed the Suffolk Strangler, something along those lines. Well, he was said to have been working on the cruise ship Queen Elizabeth II, QE2, during the same period of time that Suzy was. And here, at least, you know, in my head, I was like, okay, well, that's a touch point. We never had that with John Cannan. What happened there? Nothing, really. Suzy's brother Richard, even in 2021 articles that I have seen, still wants the police to interview the Suffolk Strangler, and he is already in jail serving the life sentence. Now, his spree, I looked a bit into his crimes, and his spree took place in 2006. So if he was with Suzy on the cruise liner, he knew of her, but then kept dormant for years before killing her for whatever reason, or introducing himself into her life for whatever reason, and then years after he also managed to stay dormant. That part doesn't make sense to me. If he just decided to go on a spree, you let me know what you think. Again, as I mentioned here, there's a touch point, there's some connection that maybe these 2 individuals at least knew one another. Steve Wright also targeted sex workers, which typically when people target sex workers, they target them because they assume that they are the people that nobody will miss, that will stall the investigation, that they will never be found out. And if he knew Suzy, he should have known that she had a supporting family, that she had friends. So again, I just don't see it fitting. But maybe, you know, somebody will uncover something. I would also suggest they interview him soon, because from my understanding he's in his 60s, so, you know, do not wait maybe any longer. Just again goes to say that even when there is somebody else, even when there is another connection, they will still go back to Cannan. Just like they did in 2010, when again, of a potential tip-off from a witness that said that they saw a mound of earth at around the time that Suzy disappeared at the site that was near Northern Army Barracks. They conducted another search. And that search was conducted only a few days before Diana Lamplugh died, aged 75, after suffering a stroke. I would highly suggest reading her obituary on Guardian. I'm going to read one paragraph out of it. I learned to love Diana, and anybody commenting anything against the family, as always, down under this video will be blocked. I do not care. I do not care. I'd rather have 5 people following me and not shitting on somebody's family rather than people just attacking them. Because even though these books sometimes make you think like, why does it seem like she is running the investigation, what Diana did for Suzy's case is so unprecedented. The way that Suzy's case is in the news right now, the main reason why I'm sitting here, the main reason why there is still so much attention on Suzy's case in 2022 is because of Diana. And you cannot convince me otherwise. So this is from her obituary in The Guardian. She knew she was open to criticism, but responded, "There are those who think I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. But if I had a long face and was dressed in black, I wouldn't get my message across. It certainly wouldn't bring Suzy back either." As the years passed, she became convinced that even if Suzy walked through the door tomorrow, the Suzy Lamplugh Trust would have to go on. After his wife's passing, Paul would continue to raise money and awareness of Suzy Lamplugh's case until he died, aged 87, in June of 2018. Which would be 32 years after Suzy disappeared. He died of Parkinson's, and his death just immediately ended the hopes of any of Suzy's parents seeing the justice for her daughter. Then, on October the 29th, 2018, investigators would return to Cannan's mother's former home, so it had a different owner at this point, to prepare and excavate the garden now in the hope of resolving Suzy's mystery. The news footage that David transcribed for us would say it is not the first time police have been at this particular family property. It's believed that officers first visited the premises in 1989 as part of their investigation into John Cannan, and again 17 years ago, declining to do anything on both occasions. Yesterday, all of that dramatically changed when the police returned to dig parts of the premises up. Police are investigating the theory that Cannan drove Miss Lamplugh 125 miles from Fulham to Sutton Coldfield before dumping her body in his mother's garage using an inspection pit which he filled with concrete. Then in 2019, David will hear this announcement on the radio about further searches in Worcestershire. The estate agent who went missing from London in 1986 has never been found. Officers believe she was murdered and have been searching land in Worcestershire for the past 2 weeks, but the search has now ended after nothing was recovered. Police say that they remain committed to securing justice for Suzy and her family and will continue to assess any new information received in connection with this case. Throughout all of these years and all of these searches, the police, David, other people, interviewers, journalists would reach out to Cannan in jail. The son would even be said to sort of be drip feeding, the VHS tapes, the interviews that they have had with Cannan to keep this story alive, to keep it up whenever a dig would be taking place, they kind of showcase some of the interviews to sort of make this alive in the public's eye and to show him and basically his whole presentation in these interviews, which I will play one more recent one in a minute to you. You can see he's a dickhead from a mile away. You don't even need an interview. Just from the story that I have told you, do you think he's a nice guy? No. He looks violent. He looks like he's gonna slap you in the freaking face. He looks like a dickhead and sounds like one. But that doesn't mean that he is guilty of this. And he would never say that he was responsible for Suzy's murder. And I'm thinking he is in his late 60s himself. Why not confess at this rate. And you might think, well, that's a really stupid thinking because he still has the option to be out of prison, which we are to talk about next. But as you will hear from this interview, he owns up to the other crimes that he had committed, saying he has done things in his life that he is sorry for.
I don't really see, as things currently stand, what else there is to be said. Mrs. Lamplugh thinks I've done it. She's accused me of doing it. I've tried I've spoken to you 3 times, to the Met, not to you personally. I've spoken to the Met 3 times. I've answered every question you've put to me. I've invited Mrs. Lamplugh herself up to the prison, Franklin Prison, to have a quiet word to me, to question me, or if her husband wants to question me. And I've said I'll go on the lie detector test, the truth drug, or anything you want to put me on.
And he is adamant about never having anything to do with Suzy's disappearance, saying that in the past he spoke to Diana, that he spoke to the family, and he answered every question that the police had, really wanting them to just drop this investigation completely.
I'm trying, as I've always tried, for 12 years, to try and help you, to try and help persuade you that it wasn't me.
I'm taking this stance for not helping yourself or me.
Well, I'm certainly helping myself. I certainly don't want things being leaked to the media anymore. I think I'm helping myself very nicely. I have committed crime. I've done many things wrong in my life. Things that, believe me, I am genuinely sorry for. 1 or 2 things I haven't been caught for.
John Cannan's lawyer, called Dean Kingham, actually applied to the parole board for Cannan to either be recategorized as a lower-risk prisoner or released, because he has already served over 30 years out of his 35-year sentence. Actually, from what I have seen, he's eligible for parole in October this very year, 2022, and then they are to decide whether he will be put in another day release program, possibly he will get probation, or, if he will still have to serve some time until 2023, which I think would have been his original release date. Even though, if math serves me right, he was convicted in 1989, which would mean if he was to serve full term, for no good behavior excuses and bullshit, he shouldn't be out until 24. But probably there is something where they have found some sort of leeway, some sort of appeal for him, because, well, they're considering it this year. And what David mentions in the book is that the parole board actually has the right to make this decision. They could decide the burden of proof, and I'm just thinking, considering everything that we have heard, all of the false allegations, if he has a half-decent lawyer, they can sell that. Like how incriminating, how he was falsely accused throughout these whole years, how unfair that is, and he might just be able to convince the parole board in his favor. Rather though, David sees this from a completely different angle than I initially did, which is maybe suddenly all of these trips to the family house, to Norton Barracks, to all these places, sometimes really without a probable cause, let's be honest. Sometimes they would just show up and you think like, why? After all of these years, why? Why only search the patio? Why only then search the garden? What are the reasons? If you think about it from the perspective where the parole board has the ability to make a finding of fact, deciding without a criminal trial on a much lower burden of proof that John Cannan might have been involved in the murder of Suzy Lamplugh, then all of this shows some clarity. The fact that the police was really trying for all of these years, while the laws have been changing, where the parole board has been given this power now, David thinks that it might be the complete opposite. That not just that they won't release him, but rather they might actually keep him in prison as much as possible. So the questions remain, even when he is released, because unfortunately he probably will be, either this year or next year. What will he do? Will he return to what was previously his family's home? I think it has a new owner now, so I doubt that that will be the way. Will the police then follow through in order to potentially find another dumping site, maybe a place where he is emotionally connected to, and then again attempt to find a search warrant, relentlessly trying to connect John Cannan with the murder, or the disappearance rather, of Suzy Lamplugh. David suggests, would it be so crazy to think that what happened to Joanne Edison happened here? The police never thought it was crazy to dig up every single yard in connection to John Cannan before he was in prison. Every single place that could even remotely be connected to him. And about 1,000 times just never find a way to incriminate him. But rather, they ignored the place that was right next to where Suzy was living. The place that was connected to Suzy's disappearance, because her items were there. The Prince of Wales pub. And this is the theory that he is proposing. And Caroline, the researcher, is a bit doubtful. I'm gonna admit, Caroline was like, okay, I'm listening, but like, you kind of sound crazy. You're kind of going through the McGrady route of it all. She didn't say that, she's lovely, she's not a bitch. I am calling McGrady a bit of a nutter, not gonna lie about that. But they never looked into the connections that the victim herself put into this diary of hers and the known place where the items were. So let us discuss David's theory proposed in the book. And for that, let us go a bit further back into the pub history. The history of the pub called Prince of Wales in Fulham. In the 70s and 80s, Prince of Wales was the it girl, okay? It was the pub to be in. It would have the billiards room, it would be a really spacious, huge pub where people would come in for spending some time beyond your Sunday roast. But then Harvester opened up close by. And Harvester, if you are not from the UK, how would I explain Harvester? Well, the book calls it what is expected of the Great British Boozer. And the Prince of Wales pub now had a competition. Harvester breakfast. I will never forget. Brighton Harvester breakfast. They have like that, you know, buffet. It fills all my dreams up. Listen, I ate like 2,000 calories at that breakfast. They have no doubts. They absolutely have no doubts. The point of the story, now Prince of Wales had competition and they had to revamp. This would set in place some chain of changes, because now they had to introduce the kitchen, they had to introduce the food, not just the booze, into their pub, and this will be the start of the makeover. Meaning that in the 18 months before Suzy had gone missing, the pub would go through some dramatic transformation. So there was an open yard and a pot house next to the billiard room, and this they managed to convert into the kitchen area. And then what was famously the billiard room was changed into a dining room. And now the floor height of that billiard room, now dining room, was raised. And this created this whole stage section in a way that was several feet high, where the local office workers would dine, you know, on whatever the fuck they wanted to eat on that day. And now the outside area has kind of shifted, where they would put all of those picnic benches, basically where Suzy's items would be found, in a completely different corner. But our boy David actually went to visit the pub, and this is how he describes that lifted up area. He went into the basement and he saw what he thought to be the wall, but rather it was a wall mostly concealed by cardboard boxes that were stacked up really high, and behind that there was the space that was what was originally underneath the dining room. From how he describes, and I couldn't find any pictures, I'm going to look further, I'm gonna look at his Twitter to see like if he posted them anywhere. I think I checked the website as well, couldn't find shit, because I'm trying to picture this in my head, because I'm a visual human. So there is an area, because what I'm picturing, if you elevate a certain area, there's that gap between what used to be the level and then the elevation. And that's where he sees, you know, kind of like an empty spot. So he, from what I gathered, managed to take a look into it. And he just like rubble, dirt, maybe like, you know, cans of drinks when people were refurbishing. Of course, they're not gonna like clean that up, like, fuck it, it's not like something that, I don't know, smells, it's not doing any damage, they're just going to leave that behind. They're not gonna do extra cleanup when they don't have to. When he points out to the hole and also to the inspection hatch, the owner of the pub then tells him that, you know, the inspection, the pest kill guys sometimes come and go into that hole, basically to check for mice, to put some poison in, anything like that. So they would have access to that area, obviously only if allowed. But now as David is standing in that basement, asking when did all of these works, when were they finalized? And this person, this pub owner, tells him that all of the works were done by 1984. Well, that means that whatever rubble is in this hole, or whatever is under the surface of that pub when it was reconstructed, would still be the same, because the pub was virtually intact since 1984, which means it was intact since 1986, which poses the question, what if Suzy had gone in that day to pick up her items and never left? The basis for David's theory, because Caroline, as you could imagine, also thought that that was a bit of a stretch, that was a bit insane. Because, you know, how would have somebody concealed that? That would maybe mean that he's incriminating some people that he might have interviewed, etc., etc. It poses a lot of questions. And when he examined, when he kind of had a peek into that hole, he was talking to the pub owner at the time, and the pub owner started mentioning how, except from rats, he would sometimes have issues with flies. And at first it seemed like, you know, it was just like bar flies going onto anything that's sugary, I don't know, like a glass of lemonade or whatever. But then this guy said that there was also an issue of like blowflies infestation in that very cellar. When David looked into that, he gave us like a full-ass breakdown of these flies. Blowfly larvae are carry-ons, which means that as soon as they supposedly find a cadaver, a dead body, sometimes within minutes of death, they can lay eggs onto it. And each fly would deposit about 250 eggs in the natural openings of the body or the open wounds. So basically the process of infestation is then quick. Within 24 hours, it goes into the first stage maggots and they all begin to feed. Within 7 to 9 days, they would go through different stages and eventually they would switch to grown-ass adult flies, and then the cycle would start all over again. Now, how would somebody not notice the smell is the question that David, of course, as the ex-police officer, has had. And Michael, the pub owner, offered him an explanation. Well, rather you can see one side of that explanation, which is that if this was to have happened, Suzy's body would have decomposed pretty quickly inside of that hatch, of that hole that was there once the place was elevated. Michael mentions two other reasons which in David's mind could have masked the smell. One was the sewer in the area, so he does remember like the intense smell of sewage, Michael, the pub owner, that is during that time, but you know, they just attributed it to this sewer that they know was down the road. Which, can you imagine how disgusting? You're sitting at a pub drinking a pint and it just smells of sewage and you're like, well, the river is nearby, like, gross. And then the second one was that that area underneath the dining room was dry. So even though the rest of the pub might not have been, you know, even though they have been freshly refurbishing it, even though the area was close to the river, the body inside of the dry conditions would have been decomposing differently. And then also if it is attacked by flies, that would speed up the decomposition. So they wouldn't probably even be able to remember it if it's only happening for a couple of weeks, rather than it happening for a longer period of time and them actually, you know, doing something extreme about the smell. Now that you know the premise of the pub theory, let us go back in time, just like we did with Cannan's. So in 1985, Michael, the then pub owner, would get his license to become a trainer. And he would be living above the pub, and he would be hiring basically these relief workers, these part-timers from just anywhere. And that is how Clive and Karen came about. People that we spoke about that basically, either took notice of the items or gave them to the police. And during the time that they would be working at the pub, they would also be living upstairs. So that is how they got hired in 1985. And actually, I think Clive and people from up north got hired in 1986, in January of that year. During that weekend, we really have no idea what was going on during Friday and Saturday, as Suzy attended her party, changed her hairstyle, and also did a shift at Sturgis. However, we know on Sunday, one of the people, probably Michael from the accounts from the book, found the items underneath the bench outside. And obviously he took them in, and then the next morning they would somehow communicate. Either the bank would call them, or they would ring the bank and get Suzy's details, and then somebody got in touch with Suzy about the missing checkbook and the personal diary. The Monday, the day of Suzy's disappearance, we know that there is a stocktake taking place in a pub. And the book, even though it doesn't offer 100% clarity on this, we know that the pub owners at the time, Michael and Zoe, would have been going to visit Zoe's sister's baby. There was a newborn, and because only inventory check was going on at the pub, he supposes that the pub might have been shut for business, that it only might have been those people there, maybe even on a Sunday night. We might not know whether or not it was operational even on a Sunday night, but most probably during Monday. Meaning that if Suzy went to the pub to collect her lost property, she would have gone during the period that the venue was closed for the public. Now, going back into Suzy's point of view here, she would have woken up just like anything. She would have exchanged some words with her lodger, Nick, during that day, and then she would have gotten to work. At some point, whether it is Sunday night or Monday morning, she realizes her items are missing. Clive or the bank, so the pub stocktaker or the person from a bank, somebody informs Suzy of where her items have been found, and she arranges to pick them up at some point during the day. In this theory, we know the dynamic inside of Suzy's office. We know that the boss of her boss is there, and that he's there having lunch with the boss. That was so beautifully worded. It's been a while. It's been about 5 hours. And that they are having lunch. She doesn't know if he is coming back, and there is the policy in place for a person who is basically above an admin position to always be present, always be at the state agency, unless they have a duty, unless they go out to have a property viewing. Possibly because of that, she puts in a 12:45 appointment with Mr. Kipper and leaves in her company car. We also know that the rush might have been justified because maybe she planned to play tennis after work. We know that she had a viewing at 6 p.m, so she wouldn't have been able to actually then have the time to play tennis, to have enough daylight time, and then go to the pub as well. And also what fits into this theory that isn't outlined is that the pub might not have been open to the general public, because if the pub was next to her house, which from my research it was, then why wouldn't she just be able to go to this pub? Pubs are usually not just shutting down at 6 p.m, which to me also makes sense with the theory that this pub was actually closed for operations. What goes into this theory is the fact that Suzy didn't take the key to the property, to the Shorells Road property that she was supposedly showing to Mr. Kipper. And why wouldn't you take the key to the property if you are going for a property viewing? Then, if pub was potentially closed, what if she bumped into somebody there who might have had the access to her personal diary? They decided to either blackmail her, expose something of hers and then they did harm to her. Maybe she went into the basement to pick it up. She was said to be claustrophobic, so maybe something had happened to her. It could have been an accident, and somebody then from that point on tried to cover it up. What doesn't really go into this theory, and I have thought of, was that the diary was found, according to the police, and according to Clive and everybody, it was handed over to the police. So this person could have then taken it if this was the motive, if this is what motivated this. And, you know, the diary just wouldn't have been found in this case. For all we know, they could have sold that story to the police, as in, nobody really knew what items were missing until they were found. And really nothing solid was also found in that diary to offer us any closure, which police would have probably readily exposed to the public if something was actually pointing to the potential killer. You have to take into consideration the time that Suzy left for this supposed viewing. It was the busiest area, it was the busiest time of day, it was lunchtime, everybody was probably out eating lunch somewhere. So what would be logical there was for any foul play to have happened inside of some venue. Then we have spoken about, you know, that the venue virtually hasn't changed for over 3 decades, that there is the space underneath the dining room floor, that there are pub owners that have complained about blowflies, dry environment plus the sewage in the area. And also, if we are thinking about a getaway vehicle, whether it is Cannan, whether it's not, you need to drive down one of the most famous streets in Fulham, Fulham Road, and then get out wherever it is. It just doesn't make sense with the time of day, this happening in broad daylight. And when talking about Suzy's own vehicle, somebody also was thinking on their feet. They were thinking, well, where can I put this to delay the investigation the most amount of hours possible? Let's put it somewhere where it's completely opposite, completely far from anywhere that she's associated with, apart from one single diary entry. And also, let's make sure we put it next to the Sturgis yellow board. How did we know that? Not because of the inscriptions on the car, but rather the car keys, which would have had Sturgis keychain, the estate agency keychain, on them. And then whoever that would have been in this case, they might have been long gone. If it was a relief worker, if it was somebody just part-timing, being from wherever, they would have at that point probably be able to get away with it, whether it was an accident or not. David ends this book with this paragraph. It is a dereliction of duty on the part of the police not to search underneath the dining room floor for Suzy's remains. We don't know what happened at the pub, and we don't know who was present, but murder or accident, that's where she's waiting, along with the rest of the answers about what actually happened in the pub that afternoon on the Monday of July in 1986. How much longer must Suzy wait? This is how David's book ends, but not this video, because Suzy made 3 diary entries. The police only followed one of them. They have managed to confirm that the third one was legitimate, and that's why the police was actually called in the very end, and why they waited for about 6 hours before they called the police. David followed the second one, and I wonder, was Suzy trying to tell us something with the third diary entry? Or rather the first, because in our sequence, and I feel whatever diary keeper you are, whatever note keeper you are, you usually put things, note the things down in the sequence that you plan to follow through with them. And she noted 142 Wardo bike contract diary entry first. Which to me means if she was headed anywhere, that would have probably been the first location that she would have headed to. And as we know, her car was actually found closest to that location, closest to 142 Wardo. But also I'm thinking, whatever it was, it could have happened in the morning for all we know, because it was literally the very first thing in her diary. It could have already been out of the way that we are just not aware of. It could have been a simple phone call about something to do with a bike contract. So I looked into it because it irks me, and it irks me how little information I can find. And it's understandable when you see what I show you now. So this isn't, you know, like a pub, it isn't a property that then you can find information on. Rather, it is a flat. It is the area where somebody lives in. It's one of those, is it detached house when, like, you know, the doors are next to each other and the walls are like doing the deed? I think it's called semi-detached, detached, whichever it is, you know, they're common in London. Well, that is what it is. It is somebody's property, and it was last sold in year 2004. So you can find that information online, how much the property was sold for, the sale history. What you can't really find, rather, what I, who have no authority, you know, no court documents, can find, is access to the land registry for any details on the people who might have owned that place, to then research into that further, whether they ever had anything to do with bikes, or would that then lead us to find out that maybe this was some sort of bogus diary entry as well. From the book and David's brief focus on Wardo Avenue, what we know is that there is one single connection between Mr. Kipper entry, Wardo entry, and also both of those addresses. And that connection comes with a name, John Herring. The connection with Mr. Kipper is that Kipper is the type of herring. The connection between the addresses was that John lived in Wardo Avenue and Shorrolds Road. He lived in Shorrolds Road when Susan went missing. He moved in there from Wardo Avenue 6 months before Suzy went missing. So she would have gone to his house in Wardo Avenue. This place was at number 20, so it didn't have anything to do with number 142, and she only went there once, and he doesn't even think that she knows that he had moved to Shorrolds Road. So this could just be by association, if we are saying that the diary entry is bogus, that she just remembered, oh, Herring put Kipper, so it's not something super obvious for anybody to figure out. But by all accounts, Suzy Lamplugh did not leave that office thinking something will happen to her that day. Yet she left us the outline of her day and her plans. It is rare that victims in a crime case speak to us in such a clear way, and it is even more rare that they are ignored when they do, for over 30 years. This case might not be the one that will be solved with the advances in technology, rather a simple refocus on Suzy's last words. Because when a missing person is trying to tell us something, we should listen to them. And that is the case of Suzy Lamplugh. I have lost a piece of my soul, and I can't wait to hear your theories. I'm now going to record an intro, because I have a feeling I'm gonna have to split this one in two, because this is insanity. This is actual insanity. So, whatever I decide to do, I record a bogus intro now for part 3. If you have any legitimate tips, I would say to contact Crime Stoppers, or just, I have seen, I can put it on the screen, I have seen in one of the articles like the actual number of like the police squad that was looking into it at the time, but I think that was applicable at the time that the article was written in. So if anybody knows, I'm gonna pin the comment if you know of like where people should actually come with legitimate tips, okay? Don't be the McGrady of this investigation, please. This family deserves the world, they deserve so much more, and just from wherever they are, whatever happens in the afterlife, Diana and Paul deserve real answers. No fucking bullshit tips with like John West and Brando Tuna. That was like, that took a year of my life, just that stupid freaking clue. Okay, you're good. I'm gonna exit this now. Thank you for staying with me for yet another case. I know they're long, I know they're detailed as hell, and your head probably hurts, just like mine. Thank you yet again, and we will meet once again. When will we meet, Maya? Next week, what the fuck? My brain cannot work no more. Please forgive me. My brain não funciona. Okay? Não funciona. Não. Bye guys. Bye. Oh boy. Oh, next brain's coming at you.
The trust is a legacy for Suzy. I think it's a quite remarkable legacy. So many people want to do something that is positive after something awful happens. And this was real.
The thought of why one's doing it undoubtedly drives one along. Certainly what drives us both along is that in some funny way we're sort of doing it for Suzy. And that does energize one enormously.